we're going to talk about the other part that we had. The first one that we covered, that was on CRUR-F, the facilities portion, where we talked about sizing and capacity planning for the air conditioning and power infrastructure, etc. And today we'll highlight more on the IT side. And as you know, we can combine those two for those data centers that have management control over both aspects in order to come to what we call the CRUR fit. We decided to turn the numbers or the letters around. So obviously a good number in CRUR fit means your data center is fit for purpose. So let's have a look at the CRUR-IT. Just as a recap, there are again 5 criteria. Similar as in the facility portion, we also had 5. So in the IT, we have the same. We're looking at the data storage. We're looking at the overall compute power that is available, memory, and then we're going into the network portion, which we have split out in 2 criteria that we will review. And as usual, we basically divide all those ratios equally. So we divide it by 5. So we do not have one being more important than the other one. As we said before, there are no weight factors in the CRUR metric for the simple reason that those weight factors typically get abused, or they might not be fit for the purpose of each data center. And obviously we want to do a proper comparison, so that's why we have no weight factors. So let's look at the first metric, the DSUR, that is the submetric of the CRUR-IT. Looking at data storage, simple of course. We're looking at the data storage, meaning the traditional hard disk or SSD technology, etc. And we would like to make sure that it's right-sized. As you probably know, the cost of storage is declining over the years. And therefore buying too much in advance is not always beneficial. I think we all have seen it when we used to buy our own backup drives and we thought, well, shall I buy that 1 terabit or the 2 terabit? And maybe for security and safety, we thought, let's take the 2 terabit, coming to the conclusion that a few months later, the price was dropping already. So that is what we're basically looking at. The metric itself is, of course, technology independent. So it doesn't matter whether you have the traditional hard disk technology or you're working on the SSD or a combination of both. Again, just to highlight why buying too much in advance could be, not so beneficial for the organization. Here you see some graphs that is talking about the cost of storage split out by the traditional hard disk and the SSD technology. And as you can see, it's on decline. And I know that in today's environment, it might be higher due to the shortage that is currently happening in the market. But again, if you're looking over the longer term, then it will go down. The good news, as I said, for the DSUR, it doesn't matter whether you have a virtualized storage environment or a hard disk or a physical storage type of environment, or both. The metric can be applied equally. So for your scenario, what do we calculate? This is the simple formula where we're basically looking at the used capacity versus the installed capacity. Obviously, that number might vary, right? Depending on your application, you might, generate more storage over time. So for those environments where storage is, growing daily, so to speak, in a reasonable, dramatic way, and we suggest to maybe average it out over a 7-day or 30-day type of period. So to do the calculation, it is in some environments, useful to make what we call storage pools. That might be because you're looking at the effectiveness of the storage usage over different parts of the organizations. Of course, you could also say we just lump everything together when we do the calculations, but then obviously you don't know whether your number, if it's maybe not at the level that you want, whether that is caused by the people upstairs or downstairs, so to speak. So ideally, we create pools either by application or department level, whatever granularity you would like to bring into the metric. And then from there, you start averaging them out again. So In order for us to determine it, it's pretty simple nowadays, right? We can do these statistics on the storage devices. Here we see the traditional Windows type of environment where if you look at, say, disk management, or if you're looking at, say, the traditional setup, you can see what is the actual capacity of the disk and how much is being used, and obviously those two you divide. Be careful in disk management. It doesn't tell you how much is being used. It basically only tells you the free space. So don't make the classic mistake that we have seen in a few people that started working with CRUR, where they used the number of free space divided by capacity, and that obviously is the wrong number. So make sure you do the proper calculation. The more trickier environment could be the virtual storage environment. Here is a very simplistic, layout of how that could be in organizations where we have multiple compute devices connecting to a storage pool, and that is obviously virtually created. And the actual physical storage could be over multiple hardware systems. So what is it then that we look at? Because normally in a storage pool, as you know, you define the available capacity in that virtual pool. And then, of course, there is an X amount is being used. And then, of course, we have the physical hardware devices where, the whole matter is as well. Now, what we are looking for is the used capacity in the virtualized pool, because that is the actual data that you have created. So we don't look at the storage pool size itself. We're looking at the actual data being utilized, and we compare that to the physical capacity of the storage devices. Okay, so those are the two numbers that we are looking at. How much physical hardware capacity have you bought, which is the physical capacity of your storage systems, versus what is actually being used. Yeah, so don't make the mistake again that you take the storage pool capacity, for example, because that will give you a different number. Okay, so that is on the storage. Then the next metric was on the CPU. As we've said before, there are a lot of different metrics that talk about CPU performance, and they all come up with various acronyms, the flops, the MIPS, etc., etc. But for us, we didn't want to go into creating yet another metric because that's actually makes no sense whatsoever. So we made a very simple assumption that whatever CPU you have, it doesn't matter whether it's an ARM or an Intel based or X based, etc. We assume that the maximum capacity is 100% utilization. It's that simple. And then obviously we're looking at how much of that 100% theoretical capacity you have is actually being used. Now, I think for the older ones here on the call, we all know that you don't want to run a CPU at 100%, right? There is always something below. We also know that even some CPUs perform better from a power efficiency point of view at a slightly lower capacity. But of course, we want to make the metric as simple as possible. Now, utilization, we all know that it goes up and down quite dramatically over the workday. So again, here what we do, we average the metric out over a 7-day minimum, or better if you can, a monthly type of period. Now, in the traditional hardware, the stuff that you probably have on your desk, we know that we can open up a monitoring tool and look at what is being used. But it's a bit more complicated often in the virtualized environment. Here we see a traditional, very simplistic picture. We have the physical machine with the actual CPUs, and then we have the virtualized systems on top of it. So where do we measure the points again? Well, almost similar as with the storage. We are not going to use the metric measuring the CPU performance at the virtual layer, because again, that can be twisted and turned around. What we actually want to look at is, again, the physical hardware that we have purchased and that we have up and running versus how much of that particular environment is being used. So the tools, if you use monitoring, and for the CRUR-IT, you really need to have monitoring tools, because it's impossible to walk around with a piece of paper and writing down numbers, of course. Make sure that the tools are measuring it at the bare metal level, so to speak, right, instead of at the virtualized level. Same as with all the other metrics, we're basically looking at how much is being used. So we're looking at the average of the CPU load over the 7-day minimum, or better 30-day period, and we divide it again by 100. And again, we could have that measured over multiple systems or pools, as we call them. And then again, we just average those CPURs out. Memory, almost similar, right? In the end of the day, memory goes up and down in terms of usage. We also know that memory typically has a direct relationship if in terms of not the virtualized environment, but in a traditional hardware environment, typically memory is allocated to CPU. So there's a very close link. So we are looking at that again directly at the memory level. Again, averaging out, of course, because of its dynamics that we have in this particular metric. So what are we looking at? Again, here a very simplistic picture where we have the actual hardware in the bottom and we have on top of that the virtualized environment. So again, we are not measuring the utilization in the virtualized environment, but we're measuring it pure at the hardware layer of the equipment that you have installed. Okay, so this is, I think, the key message that I want to convey today when we're talking about the CRUR-IT. We're always looking at the physical portion, not at the virtualized portion in that sense. Similar as with the CPU and the others, no surprise there, measured over different pools to make it easier for you to establish which parts of the organizations or which applications are more right-sized than others and average them out. Then we have the other last two metrics. Again, this is going to be a short webinar, so that is the good point, unless you have a lot of questions. The network port usage ratio. A question that we got a few times is, why do you call it usage ratio? Why don't you call it utilization ratio? That has to do with word choice in the network environment. When people talk about network port utilization, they typically looking at bandwidth measurement rather than the count, so to speak. So again, in this particular case, we are looking at the number of network ports that are physically in use. Again, we don't distinguish between copper and fiber, and we just count every port as a port. So that is what we now need to look at. And what we have explained in the introduction, unused ports still take up power, especially when you have not disabled them, which is typically what you can do through the line interface, right, of the particular device, or the graphical interface nowadays as well. And another technique what you could do is do the right sizing in terms of port forwarding capacity. There is no point having 100 meg if you're only using less than 10 meg. You might as well tune the port down and save some power. Again, some people always say, what is the point? What are you talking about? A port is not that much. Well, in terms of power consumption for each port, maybe not, depending, of course, on what type of port it is. But if you start adding up the literally thousands and thousands and thousands of ports that we have in a data center environment, that it is going to make a dramatic difference. So what do we do? Well, same thing as usual. What have we used? What is actually in use versus what has been installed? Of course, ideally, you don't go walk around with a piece of paper and start noting it all down. There are plenty of network management tools now that can, indicate what is in use and what is not in use. So with a bit of luck, you can pull this data directly from the network management or system management tools that you might have deployed in your environment. For the bandwidth, so NBUR, which is the network bandwidth utilization ratio. So now we talk again about utilization because we are looking at the capacity of the network links. Now, here you see a picture. This is a picture out of the TA942. Most of you are familiar with that. That provides an infrastructure cabling standard for data centers. In this particular case, we have multiple access rooms where the carriers come in, and then we go into the compute room. Okay, so we measure what goes into the compute room. We don't care about what goes out to, for example, the office environments, etc. We're only looking at from carrier down into the compute room. Again, in this case, you might have multiple compute rooms. So we start measuring basically the entrance into the compute room, what we normally call the MDA. That's the most common port that we see in the traditional bigger data centers. So we're measuring at that particular level. Again, bandwidth, as all the IT stuff is fluctuating over, the time period. So again, we would like to advise a minimum of 7, if not longer. And what you need to do as a first analysis, look at, say, what are the the cable, so to speak, that we are going to drill through the computer room, typically in the MDA type of fashion. So we like to look at, say, what we call the maximum effective bandwidth. Yeah, so that is what the vendor normally indicate as the highest speed for which they can kind of like guarantee a reliable transmission rate. Yeah, sometimes you'll find that in the brochures that there are two different rates that they indicate. So we need to go, of course, for the most reliable one, and then we need to deploy, some network monitoring tool, of course, because this is not data that you can write down. As usual, we look at what has been used and what is the capacity, and that use is, of course, an average number, as we said. And again, if you have multiple connections, which undoubtedly you will have, then we take the individual ones, we divide them again by the number of connections to average out the bandwidth over the variety of connections that we have. And then we should be able to come to the final number. And then obviously we start adding all those numbers together. I did not display the formula again, but you know that we take all those 5 metrics, put them all together, yeah, and then we average them out, and that is what gives us the IT environment. So as a summary, right, CRUR IT calculation, yeah, in order for you to start, you need to really start looking at, say, what do we have, what is virtualized, what is not virtualized, which applications or which departments are using which part of the physical infrastructure, yeah, so that you have some granularity in your analysis to make sure that you do the analysis, like I said, by either application or department, so that you can instruct them to be a bit more efficient. Of course, too much detail with the CRUR facilities. It was pretty stagnant, right? UPS capacity, power consumption, those things are typically not varying so much. But with IT, it's everywhere between 0 and 100 in one day, so to speak. So you need tools. It's just impossible to do this in a manual fashion. So make sure that you get that in place. Yeah, and then calculate, of course, the sub ratios, and then make sure that you average it out to come to the final total ratio. Resources, for those of you who attended, where you can get the CRUR free download. So if you haven't done so, do so, download the document and have a read about it. And with that, we have already come to the very quick end of this webinar. So we can open it up for the questions and answers page.
Okay, great. Thanks, Edward. I already see a few questions coming in. So first question, yeah. How do we go about calculating CRUR when having a mixed environment? Example, some of our systems are traditional systems and some are virtualized.
Okay. Well, as I said, right, the first step is really to looking at, say, what are all the systems that you have in place. So you could basically list down all your physical systems where you have no virtualized environment type setup, and then you can look at, say, what is virtualized, and then especially in the virtualized environment, it requires a little bit more intelligence because we need to looking at the bare metal level, so to speak, rather than at the virtualized, and sometimes a combination, right? So in storage, we need to look at, say, the virtual storage actually being used versus the actual hardware capacity that is being set up. So like I said, you can use both. It is applicable to both environment, but you need to write it down carefully so that you don't get confused with and mix things up, so to speak.
Okay, thanks, Edward. Next question. For the storage ratio, is it allowed to take the defined pool size instead of the actual disk capacity, as the ratio might look unfavorable since we bought storage based on future growth?
That's a smart one. So let me go back to the picture. Yeah, I understand that it could be looking unfavorable, but yeah, that is the reality, right? So let me bring back this picture here. So obviously, I hope you see my mouse moving, right? You can see, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So what did he or she said? He used the capacity of the pool?
Shall I repeat the question?
Yeah.
For the storage ratio, is it allowed to take the defined pool size instead of the actual disk capacity?
Okay. Yeah. No, it's not. So basically what the person is asking, like, say, can I take these two numbers, right? So this is the defined size versus that one. And that is what we don't allow. For the simple reason is because I could say, well, I'm only using 35. So, why don't I shrink my storage pool to, like, say, 50? And then obviously your CRUR would look better, right? Because now I have 35 divided by 50 instead of 105. Well, if you would use this anyway. And then that's just playing with the numbers. So we are really looking at this particular number, the actual data that you have in use versus the hardware, so to speak, that you have bought. So you really have to look at, say, if I highlight it again, we need to look at what is the actual data that you've generated versus the physical capacity. So the answer is no, you cannot use the storage pool. It has to be the physical pool.
Thanks, Edward. One more question. We run a commercial data center, so we can't always get the information from the customer. So how do we then go about CRUR-IT?
Maybe you can't. That is the realistic answer, to be honest. If you're running in a commercial data center, then it is very, very difficult indeed. Oh, sorry, it's a big thunderstorm here. In a commercial data center, you often have no ability to go into the IT environment of the customer. What you could do, of course, so you might, as a commercial data center, say, we're only measuring the facility CRUR. We don't take IT in an environment. But if you're looking at, say, the way you could potentially motivate customers, say, hey, we have this capability, this metric that can help you to look at your right sizing. And maybe it's something that you could do. Whether they want to give you the data, doubtful, but at least you can help them still in a certain way by providing the the actual mechanisms for them to check themselves. It's always a difficult environment. We know that even asset management in a commercial data center, ideally we always like to know what is in our building. But some customers, they just say it's none of your business. We rent a suite or a floor, and whatever we put on there, that is basically up to us. There's nothing that we can disclose on that one. Then unfortunately, no management control. There's very little to none that we can do.
Thanks, Edward. One more question is, in DSUR, do we need to calculate the ratio in all RAID setup?
Yeah, well, if it's in a RAID setup, basically, again, we're looking at the hardware purchased. So if you have let's say a traditional RAID 5 setup, we're looking at, say, all the hard disk capacity, the physical capacity, and then we again looking at the usage. So obviously you will always lose some part because the whole setup within the RAID means that you are losing real capacity that you can allocate, so to speak. But that is then a side effect of that particular setup. So unfortunately, we take the full physical storage device, and then we're looking at the actual data used. It's almost a bit like a storage pool. So that is how it works. Yeah. So we don't take the RAID capacity minus the extra capacity that the RAID needs in order to do the to have the ability to recover disks over a pool set.
I think this might have been covered, but what about CRUR-FIT? How do you calculate that?
Okay, in the CRUR-FIT, basically what we do, we take the two calculations individually. So we do the facility calculation, and then we do the IT calculation, and basically we combine those two and we divide them equally by 2. So and again, the reason why we chose to split it out, because we do understand the data center environment that, as the previous person asked, we have no control over the customer, therefore we can't actually do the IT. So that's why we said, we need to split it in a facility portion and IT. Customers can use either one or both, up to their liking, and of course up to the level of control that they have over such an environment, and then apply it.
Okay, thanks for the clarification, Edward. One more question. How does storage rate setup impact storage ratio calculation?
Negatively, in that sense, because obviously in a rate type of setup, you will have some level of overkill on your, well, it's not actually overkill, but oversizing on your physical hardware setup, because the rate needs a certain amount of extra space in order to be able to fulfill the rate requirements. So yeah, you will have a problem, well, not a problem, but it negatively impacts. So if you have a RAID 5 setup, you have basically always one spare disk, so to speak, that is kind of like just for the checksums and all that stuff. Yeah, that unfortunately will have a slight negative impact, but it's not going to be a lot. And don't forget, the overall CRUR-IT, yeah, is not just looking at DSUR. So even if there might be a slight impact on the DSUR, if your other numbers are, in the top, so to speak, then the DSUR, yeah, only impacts, a fifth of the overall number. So it's not, overall, it's not a big impact. Let's put it this way. That's the short answer.
Thank you, Edward. And we are done with the Q&A.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That means it was all very clear, I hope. So that's good. That's good.
Yeah, so yes, we have come to the end of the webinar.
Well, thanks everybody again. I hope it was useful. I hope that all of you start having a look at the uses of CRUR. I think it's a good metric to help you to do the right sizing and therefore have a positive contribution to return on investments, but also on the environment. Again, if you have any questions, always feel free to ping us. So if you have any question, if you want to have a one-on-one to discuss in more detail, do not hesitate to ping us, and we will be very glad to help you on your way to start using this metric. So I guess with that, we can close the session page. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah.
See you again, hopefully soon.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye.